This is Dan, and this is the Napkin Academy. This lesson, we're beginning to close out our phase of imagining, and we're going to review the squid a couple of more times. But this time, we're going to get very, very practical. We're going to think about how to use this squid, which is a pretty remarkable tool. And I want you to think about the squid as a tool you can take with you the next time someone says, "Hey, let's brainstorm. I want you to think outside the box. I want you to use your imagination." Instead of saying, how would I do that? I want you to say, aha, I'm going to use the squid. Now there are two ways to use this squid. The first way is to say, what do I think of my idea? What do I think? The second way is to say, what does my audience think of my idea? What do they think of it? Let's look at the first way. Let's say that I've got an idea. And I don't know, my idea might be literally a box, and I'm going to have to think about my box in a new way. So as I'm staring at that box, and my mind is just seeing box, but I know that I need to see some more options. What might I do? Well, let's run it through those 5 questions and see if we can't come up with something new. So let's go ahead and take our box at the starting side of the squid, and we're going to run it through every one of these questions. And as we get to the end, exactly as we remember when we started this example, we will have come up with a whole bunch of different ways to show our box. Maybe we'll have our box by itself. Maybe we'll have our box, unfolded. What happens if we take and unfold our box? What would happen if we smashed our box, squished it flat? What would happen if we didn't start with a box at all? So that's way number 1 to use the squid. Start with our original idea and ask ourselves each of the questions as we go through our idea, expanding our imagination and expanding the range of ideas that we can have. So you might remember a long time ago when we started the whole squid lesson, I started out with an apple. We drew an apple and we came up with a bunch of different ways. And now, over these last few lessons, you've been coming up with a whole slew of different ways to think about perhaps your orange, maybe it was your computer, maybe it was your car. And I'm just going to try to imagine what some of those ways might be. If we look at the orange, I'll bet some of you came up with very simple ways of drawing the orange. Maybe some of you came up with a way of representing the orange on an orange tree. We were talking about the vision. Maybe some of you came up with, a glass of orange juice. How would we make it? Well, we'd have to get an orange. We'd slice it in half, and then we'd get an orange juicer, and we'd put it on, and we'd turn it, we'd squeeze it, and pour out our orange juice into a cup. Lots of ways of looking at an orange. Maybe some of you who are looking at a computer perhaps did start out with a very simple view of a computer. And by the time you were taking it through the squid, you might have ended up with, I don't know, I'm guessing that probably someone came up with the idea of a computer that we actually wear on our body. Some future state of the computer where we have our keyboard and we have our microphone built right in. And instead of having to lug around this brick all the time, we just wear our computer with us. Maybe someone came up with an idea like that. And maybe one of you who was drawing the car might have started out with perhaps a very simple view of a car, and maybe came up, by the time you had run it all the way through the squid, with something that was completely different. I don't know, maybe someone came up with the idea of a flying car. That would have been kind of cool. Maybe someone came up with that. Let's put wings on a car, put a propeller on the front, and now we can have it fly. So whatever it was, that is how I really want you to think about using the squid in way number 1. What was that again? How do I think about my idea? There's not just me and my idea, which now has many, many different forms. There's someone that I have to show it to. There are the people over here who are saying, okay, we know you've been off working on this wonderful idea. Why don't you go ahead and wow us? We're ready. And we, as the owner of the idea, have got to think about what are this people, what is our audience going to be willing, let's go ahead and write that down. What is our audience willing to see? Because we have to, first of all, now that we've got our idea nailed down in many different forms, think about who are we showing it to? For example, are we showing our idea to those kids? They want to see something pretty interesting, pretty basic. Or are we sharing our idea with a bunch of experts, people who have a different view of it? Or are we showing our idea to the business people who want to know exactly how much it costs? Or are we sharing our idea with a group of people who might be personally invested and very angry or very passionate about it? Is every one of these groups going to want to see exactly the same picture of our idea? No, because each one of these groups has something very different in their own minds. Now, why does my audience matter? Why do I care? Well, remember the simplicity principle way back there, the idea that someone who is not an expert needs to see a simple view of our idea up front in order to become willing to look at it, and someone who is an expert wants to see a more elaborate view of our idea in order to understand exactly how they fit in and know that we're competent in being able to represent it. That's one of the things that we need to think about. And is the person that we're going to be showing our idea to someone who's likely to have an emotional response, or perhaps someone who's more interested, tap, tap, tap on the adding machine over here, to know what are the numbers? Someone's going to have an emotional view, or someone's going to have a highly rational numeric view. Or are we looking at somebody who's interested in our destination or at the steps we need to take to get there? And are we going to be showing our idea to someone who's interested in how it is today or how it might be in the future? Does it need to be like this at all? Let me just give you an example of why it's so important to think about our audience. Have you ever used one of these things here? A computer keyboard? Well, of course you have. And have you ever found that this might not be absolutely the smoothest and most effective way to be able to convey every idea? It's not. The fact is that the keyboards we have today for inputting all of our text and all of our ideas from a verbal perspective that keyboard is actually a terrible device. It was intentionally designed not to work very well. Not to work well. And the reason was because the earliest typewriters that looked something like this had a recurrent problem, which was that as we started to type faster, so here we are, we've got our idea flowing and flowing, and we've got our hands on that keyboard of that big old machine, and we're tapping like mad, what would happen? Well, very soon, the keys, the actual metal keys, would get snarled up, and the entire machine would just come to a complete stop. So what happened, in order to avoid our machines from getting locked up, was a man named C. Latham Scholes, way back in 1873, came up with an interesting way to lay out the keys on our keyboard so that we would not be able to go fast. In fact, the whole design of his keyboard, which was called QWERTY, because it started with Q, W, E, R, T, Y, before going through the rest of the alphabet, was intentionally designed to not be fast, so that our hands on the right and left sides had to alternate as they were typing in order to slow us down so that we wouldn't break the machine. Well, later on the machines got better, and a year 1936, a man named August Dvorak came up with a completely new keyboard that was proven to be much, much, much faster and would have been more appropriate for the use on our modern machines, would have kept our hands being able from going so slow, allowed our hands to actually type even faster We'd all be faster typers. But you know what? Nobody uses the Dvorak keyboard. Goes back to our idea because it was a wonderful, fantastic idea that wasn't made compelling to anybody else. There was too much invested in the old standard, and nobody uses what would have been a better idea. The lesson we want to take away, if we want our idea to matter to other people, we have to make sure that we take into consideration what they are willing to look at and what they're willing to accept. Let's do it now. How do I use the SQVID to help me think through what my audience might think? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to use the SQVID as a kind of a visual equalizer. Now, what I mean by that is if you've ever had a stereo system or even on your mobile device and you're listening to your music, you'll know that one of the things that you can do is you have a series of sliders that allows you to set how high the bass or how low the treble is. I want you to use the SQVID as the exact same thing as a visual equalizer, and what we're going to do is we're going to set our sliders. Imagine that each one of these was a slider based on what we think is going to be most interesting to our audience. So let's say this is who we anticipate our audience to be for our idea, and what we want to do is try to put ourselves in that person's mind as we think about our own idea and imagine what is likely to be the most appealing to that person based on what we know about them, their role, perhaps their age, their expertise, their interests, their motivations. Are they going to be more interested in a simple view or an elaborate view? And what I want us to do is go ahead and imagine that we've got these sliding buttons that we can push up and down across each step of the SQVID, imagining what's going to make the most sense for that person. So to move this away from the theoretical and move it into the real for a moment, let's do a little business case study. And in this case, I want us to imagine that we work at a company called Marge's Teapots. And here's the factory. And here's Marge herself, very famous, one of the most famous manufacturers of teapots ever. And we've been looking at Marge's business for a while, and we've come up with some ideas. Idea number one is that at Marge's, we run two different assembly lines. One assembly line makes the lids for the teapot, and one assembly line actually makes the pots themselves. What we're thinking about, and we're thinking, well, we, in these times of efficiency, could probably save money by combining those onto one assembly line. Rather than running two, what would happen if we just ran one? We think it's a good idea, but again, this is a business case study. We have a lot of different people that we need to convince to look into our idea. Well, who, for example? So let's say over at Marge's, we have Marge, who really is the CEO, and then let's say we have Bob over here, who's the project manager. Whatever it is that Marge decides, Bob is the one who actually has to figure out a way to make it happen. And then we've got Mary over here, and Mary is in charge of the money. So whatever Marge decides that Bob can figure out how to make work, Mary has to decide, well, that's great, but do we have the money to do it? And then we've got Steve over here, and Steve is the guy who actually runs the assembly lines. He's the guy to whom everybody reports that does the work. So after Bob's decided what can be done, Mary's decided how to fund it, Steve is the guy who has to figure out how it's going to work way down on the line. And then we have another audience. Who do we have over here? Well, we have the board. These are the people that are helping Marge make good decisions about the success of the company. Every one of these people is going to have to be approached and convinced if we want our idea to move forward. So let's get more specific. Let's look at this for a moment. Here's Marge. She's, of course, the CEO. She was actually the founder of this company. Let's think about what kind of SQVID settings would we want to set. Remember what our idea was. We want to take two assembly lines and move them into one. What is Marge likely to go see, to be interested in seeing, given the fact that Marge is extremely busy? And by virtue of her job, Marge is really in charge of the vision of the company. But she's also got to be responsible for anything that might happen. So how would we set the SQVID for Marge? I'm willing to bet that Marge is going to prefer a simple view because she's so busy she needs to know really at the end of the day what is it we're talking about. Marge probably is going to want a more qualitative view. She's got money people to worry about the numbers. She wants to know how is this thing actually going to affect the business. Marge is probably going to be looking for something that's more like the visionary view rather than the actual details. She's got Bob to take care of the details. Marge is probably going to be interested, I'm guessing, in something that compares what we're talking about with perhaps what she has now. And so Marge is certainly going to be interested in some kind of quick comparison of what she has now to how it might be different. So the picture that we might draw for Marge would have to be something that was fairly simple, something that was fairly qualitative, something that was fairly visionary. Well, how about this? How about if we drew a very simple picture even on the back of a napkin for her and said, Marge, as it stands today, the way our teapots get made is we have 2 assembly lines. What we're suggesting is that in the future, we go with 1 assembly line. We don't totally shut the other one down, but we use it for research and development. So, Marge, here's what we think. We move from this model to this model. It's going to help us become more efficient, and yet it won't have any impact on the quality of the teapots that we make. Good enough, she says. Pass it on to the rest of the team. Let's see what they think. Which brings us over to Bob. Well, you remember what Bob was responsible for? Bob was the project manager. He's the guy who needs to be able to decide exactly how the shifting of assembly lines is going to work. What is Bob going to want to see? I'm willing to guess that Bob is going to want to see a pretty elaborate picture, one that shows as quantitatively as possible what it is that we're recommending and exactly how we think we're going to execute this idea. Bob isn't interested in comparing it to anything. He wants to know exactly what it's going to look like, and he wants to know how that's going to change what he has to do. So what picture might we draw for Bob? So we would draw a completely different picture for Bob. He's not interested in that back of the napkin sketch. He needs to see more detail, more elaboration, more that can be quantified. Oh, and here's a little side note. You know, if you want to impress project managers with your drawing, go ahead and draw them on graph paper. Yeah, just a little side note. So here we have our graph paper drawing that we wanted to show Bob, and Bob would say, okay, Mary tells me that you've got this idea. How is that going to impact me? We'll say, well, Bob, okay, here's what we're suggesting. As you know, right now, we've got 2 lines. One line makes pots. One line makes lids. What we're recommending is that we actually take 2 of the people from this line. We shift them over to this line. We take lids. We shift them over to the same line. We don't completely shut this line down. What instead we do is we keep 1 person on there, and we use that line with 1 person working as a way to continue to do research and development in line, but now we're focused on manufacturing all on just one of our assembly lines. Let's say Bob then says, fine, well now we've got to take it over to Mary. And as we remember, Mary was the person who's interested in paying for this. How much money is this going to save us? Mary is probably going to be interested in a pretty elaborate view, but Mary is absolutely going to be primarily interested on the quantitative side. Give me the numbers, give me something that I can measure. The rest might be of less consequence to her. So as far as Mary is concerned, the picture that we might want to make is one that's really going to focus on the quantities. How does this our idea have a fiscal impact on our company? So what might be the picture that we would draw for Mary? Well, how about something that showed payroll expenses? And, you know, if you want to impress someone who's on the financial side, go ahead and do your drawings on the yellow legal pads. Makes a difference. So here's what we'd say. We say, Mary, you know, with existing 2 lines, this is how many people we employ. And that's great. And what we're proposing, though, is given these hard times that we're going to cut 1 line. But rather than losing a lot of people, we're only going to have to let 1 person go. It's sad, but we're going to have to let 1 person go anyway. And if we don't become a more efficient business, the whole business might shut down. But what we're going to do is we're going to save that amount. We're hopefully not going to have to reduce our output, because what we're going to be able to do is take these 2 positions, which in previous models might have had to be eliminated, and we're going to keep them and shift them to R&D so that strategically we can start looking at new products. We could continue after Mary's seen the idea, then we need to pass it along to Steve, who needs to see a very elaborate set of settings. something very quantitative, exactly how I'm going to do it. I want to know, how does it compare to the line I have now? How does what I do now, how is it going to change? A different set of pictures for Steve. And what picture in the end would we need to show the board? Well, now we're going into the boardroom. We're going to show it to these scary folks and say, look, we're talking about changing our business. They're primarily going to want to know two things. They're going to want to know, okay, what is the vision and how much is it going to cost? And so, in summary, how to use the SQUID? Two ways. The first way is to help us clarify what's in our own mind. I think this. And I want to open up my imagination, so I have 5 questions I ask myself to help me go from one idea to an explosion of ideas. Number 2 is I use the SQUID to imagine what it is that other people want to see, what is going to be interesting to my audience, help me get into their minds so that I can say, where do I want to set my equalizer to make sure that the picture I draw is the one that makes the most sense to these people? 2 uses for how to use the SQUID.